Welcome, everyone. We're excited to have you here at the 2023 ConnectEd Spring Webinar Series, Spring Forward. This spring, we are exploring ways that we can know our students more deeply and create learning spaces where they can thrive. My name is Deborah Masacci. I work in the University of Washington College of Education ConnectEd office. It's our Office for Professional and Community Learning. And it's my pleasure to host today's webinar, A Historical Perspective, Supporting Youth Identities Through Literacies. And today we have with us Dr. Lakia Omogan, Jazz Moultrie, and Christina Barriot. And with that, I will turn the mic over for you all to introduce yourselves and get us started.
All right, I'll hand it over to Jazz or Christina to introduce first.
Okay, I'll go ahead and go. Hi, everybody. I'm Jazz. I'm a story holder and filmmaker studying communication at the University of Washington, Seattle. My interests include literacy, fugitive education, performance, archiving, madness, and speculative fiction. And the project I'll be presenting today is part of my dissertation work, and it'll grow into be my life's work as I expand it to my hometowns.
Hi everyone, I'm Christina Barriot. I'm a master's student here at the College of Education, studying language literacy and culture. My work is inspired by the border of Juarez El Paso, and I am currently researching testimonio and centering our commitments to our multilingual students.
And hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Lakia Omogan, and I'm an assistant professor of language literacy and culture here in the College of Education. And my research focuses on Black African immigrant youth, which stems from my own personal life growing up between my African American and Nigerian identities. And so I really am drawing on my lived experiences as my professional experiences with the project that I'm presenting on today in partnership with Nigerian immigrant youth. And so what we'll do now is we will transition to just our presentation. And I just want to say that I feel very honored to be alongside and in community and partner with both Jazz and Christina, who are phenomenal, just people, human beings, but then also the work that they're doing in community with the people that they care deeply about. And so with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and take us to the framing of our presentation across all three. So you can kind of just see how we're framing this. This is called a historical perspective. And with further ado, I'm going to take a moment to take a look at the historical perspective of literacy in the United States. So bear with me. And so I always like to say whenever I talk about literacy is that we cannot talk about literacy in this country without thinking about the history of all the policies and things that have been passed in this country. And I want to open with a quote from Dr. Arlette Willis, and she says that literacy has been the subject of heated debates for decades. And this comes from one of her articles from way back in 1997, but even though we're in 2023, this still holds true today. And so she also argues that over time, the definition and purpose of literacy has evolved in response to changes in the history of the United States. And so we're going to really frame all of our presentations with a historical framework that she provides of literacy, which is really important with how we're thinking about literacy today. And so she takes a historical look at how literacy has changed, its definition as well as its purpose has changed over time. And if we take a look at from the historical perspective, like the early 1900s, and we can even argue even before then, literacy was typically defined as a skill, this ability to read and write. And it was this idea that it was a means to an end, a means of upward social mobility, particularly for white men in this country. Unfortunately, it was inaccessible to African American, Indigenous, Latinx, and other marginalized identity populations, and that mostly came through the denial of literacy and especially public schooling. And then as we moved into the 1920s through the mid-1960s, we have what can be categorized or defined as literacy as a school knowledge. And it's this idea that it's a cognitive skill and it can be measured as an indicator of intelligence. So when you think all things science related to school achievement, that is this era here. And I put those skulls in the lower right-hand corner because it's this idea that literacy can be tested in this IQ element of all these things. So you have what is called like intelligence test. It bursts what most people know as the literacy gap. And I put that in air quotes because we know, according to Dr. Gloria Latson-Billings, we can't talk about the gap without focusing on the education achievement debt that is owed to all these marginalized populations. So you have scientific measurement, scientific management of skills, and sadly, the very, very harmful practice of eugenics that really harmed immigrant African-Americans, indigenous populations, and so many more people. So this idea that the more literate you are, the more knowledgeable you are, and it was measured in terms of like science. And so as we think about those first two early definitions of literacy, we can see that race, Willis argues that race, class, ethnicity, gender, language, geographical location, and so many other socio-cultural factors have been largely avoided, ignored, marginalized, and misrepresented in literacy studies, which basically means that when people were thinking about literacy, they were not thinking about these elements. And who were these people who were defining it? As we know, historically, it was predominantly white men in this country. Again, connected to policies, connected to the elements that were happening in this country. And so you can see in the 1960s onward, there kind of became this wave of really thinking about literacy as a social and cultural construct. So this idea that literacy is not just reading and writing, it's not just a skill, it's not just brain knowledge, but it is actually a social practice. And that's where we get all of the 1995, again, Dr. Gloria Latson-Billings, we get Paris and Aleem and their piece on culturally sustaining teaching. And a lot of this stems from this idea of increased access to the internet, this understanding of literacy, not just happening in schools, but in communities, in practice, in people's homes, and understanding that literacy is not just opening a book and reading and writing, but that it is situated culturally, that is situated socially, and it exists in so many modalities. We're thinking visual, we're thinking technological, we're thinking tactile, right? All these different ways that we can define and make sense of literacy. So we're talking about the 1960s onward. And so we come to this question, I really want to frame this and anchor our introduction of what is literacy? And according to Willis and so many other literacy scholars, including myself, we argue that there is no singular definition of literacy, that there have been multiple definitions of literacy over time. And again, I cannot emphasize this enough, that literacy is more than reading and writing. And so where are we today? Unfortunately, in the United States, we've come back, we've done a full circle, and we've come back to this idea of literacy as a skill, which is why we have these literacy wars, right? The debate, as Willis said, has always been contested for years, and it's still being contested today, which is through the science of reading. It's a hot thing right now. And it's this idea that schools, education programs are really pushing for the science of reading. But I made sure to put the United States flag on the right, because we cannot talk about this without thinking about how this is connected to a political agenda. So there's this idea that we're going back to this heavy focus on word recognition and excluding all of these other ethnic, racial, socio-cultural elements of literacy. And unfortunately, it is very, very harmful to go back to this idea of literacy, because the United States has become increasingly more diverse racially, ethnically, linguistically, and to revert back to this only focus on literacy as a skill and word recognition does not do any of our students, any of the youth in the United States a service. It's actually a disservice. And so we argue in terms of, as we get ready to transition into our openings, the goal is not to get rid of literacy basics, but rather to couple it with forms of literacies that are inclusive of students' racial, ethnic, historical, gender, linguistic, technological, and geographical factors for an equitable, just, and anti-racist approach to literacy education. We cannot talk about literacy without attending to all of these factors. Again, literacy is more than reading and writing. And in order for us to really think about who students are and to support their identities, we have to take a step back and look at broader approaches to literacy teaching, literacy learning, not just in schools, but in community spaces as well, which is what you will see as we all present today. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and transition over to Christina.
Thank you, Lakia. All right, 1 second. All right. Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to be sharing a little bit about multimodal testimonio and centering our commitments for our multilingual students and families. So this work is work that I'm doing in my master's thesis, and it's done in partnership with 2 multilingual teachers here in the state of Washington. So I'm going to tell us a little bit more about who we are. So we are Lupe, Alejandro, and Cristina, and we gathered twice and engaged in multilingual storytelling through the form of testimonio, and by sharing our journey as multilingual and multicultural students growing up in the United States and then as educators. So here are some commonalities that we share. Our parents all immigrated from Mexico into the United States in search of opportunities for their families. Lupe and Alejandro are both from the same town in Eastern Washington, and I am from El Paso, Texas. We are currently on our journey recentering multilingualism into our lives. And some things that we shared is that from the very beginning in our education, our names were mispronounced, changed, or misspelled. Alejandro shared that he became Alex. Lupe or Guadalupe shared that a lot of people had trouble pronouncing her name, and I became Cristina con la H, or Cristina with the H. And it just began to create some tensions in our identities too. We also experienced a lot of erasure with Spanish in a school setting, which is ironic because our communities and where we come from, people speak primarily in Spanish. And so even though this did foster tensions in our identities multilingually, it became a strong foundation in our commitments in the work we're doing as educators. And so right now, Lupe is an English language arts teacher in Eastern Washington, and Alejandro is a dual language co-teacher in grades kindergarten through 5th grade here in Western Washington. And I'm currently a coach for the elementary teacher preparation program and an instructor during the summertime. So I brought multimodality into our sessions because it was really important for me that our stories be shared in a way where we weren't limited to one medium and that we could best convey our truths. So this was a space where we were going to give witness to one another, listen with our hearts, and hopefully find healing and co-construct knowledge with one another as we center our commitments to our students and their families. So I brought in 3 artifacts to support my testimonio. The first one is a dress that highlights my time in Austin as an educator. Then a poem I wrote a while back that just highlights my feelings moving between El Paso and Chihuahua and constantly crossing the border. And finally, a letter I received from a student in my first year teaching. So some findings that we encountered during our testimonial sessions is that learning is not limited to the school setting. It happens daily in our students' homes and communities. So collaboration with families and including family knowledge is vital to our lesson planning. Our students also should not have to sacrifice their identity or being in school through a one-size-fits-all standard. So centering student voice, knowledge, and experience is also something we are committed to. And the last thing is moving away from individuality to co-constructing knowledge and students supporting each other in their learning. So really centering that community well-being over individualism and competition. So Lupe defines literacy for visibility in her classroom. Her lessons highlight families working in the fields. Lupe has many students whose parents work in the fields, and when I spoke to her at this particular time, her students were reading Esperanza Rising. Also, in her previous year as a teacher candidate, Lupe worked with her students in a lesson about their community, and students got to interview their parents about their profession and roles in their community. And here one student writes, "Un dato increíble es que mi papá cocina para muchas personas." So an incredible fact is that my father cooks for a lot of people. And so she's really centering community knowledge alongside her students. Alejandro has a strong commitment to centering student voice in their writing and storytelling. So something that Alejandro always tells his students is, ahora vamos a ponerle tajín a nuestra escritura. So now we're going to add tajín to our writing. And what this is the details and that which makes their stories their own and authentic to their being. So we reflected on multimodality in our testimony session and how that felt. And when we talked about it, Alejandro shared that it really represents how we construct knowledge and make sense of the world. It happens through many mediums. And so one of the goals is moving away from these like objective ideas of meaning to teach students the subjectivity of language, and that we are the ones who make and give meaning to things through various forms or mediums. So why does this matter? Here we go. So how we define literacy will lead how we teach. And here we're viewing literacy as for healing and liberation. And so in a sense, who are our students? What are their stories, their journeys, and how can we center their voice in our teaching? And I want to leave you with two takeaways from Lupe and Alejandro. So the first one is when we talked about like the connections that we're seeing with ourselves and our work, Lupe shared that I would connect how we came up in the education system, how it wasn't serving us, and how we wanted to turn that around little by little for our students. And then Alejandro shares, because as a brown student going through a white system, I saw a lot of inequity. I couldn't see myself in the curriculum. I want to be one of those teachers that's there on the ground with kids struggling and learning, not trying to put them into a box. So how are we going to learn from our students to foster humanization and literacy? Thank you so much for listening to my presentation.
Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Jazz, and I'm going to share my screen to begin my presentation. Okay, and before I begin, I just want to say thank you, Lakia, for inviting me, and also thank you, Christina and Lakia, for sharing this space with me. The title of my presentation is Supporting Literacies for Healing, Joy, and Being, with a focus on refusing harm with Black young people through filmmaking. Just to introduce my project, I'm building a co-created literacy project for and by Black young people ages 11 to 19 to shape and sustain space for healing, joy, and being. So this project centers their stories, refusals, and understandings of Blackness and being, especially when it comes to Black digital practice. So we'll be doing a lot of sharing of our experiences on social media. The purpose of this project is to facilitate healing through filmmaking, through storytelling and holding, and other forms of youth-led artistic expression. And just going back to the project, I do consider it art and performance-based because I do believe that art is an incredible path for healing. I have this project grounded in fugitive literacies because I do desire the abolition of most education systems in the spaces that we operate. And I also center pedagogies of Black being in this project. And so this specific teaching and learning model centers Black communities and our ways of knowing. It welcomes the fullness of Blackness, and it also prioritizes Black creativity and cultural expression. And before continuing, I just want to share a story of my own about what brings me to this work, and that is healing through madness. For me, it was the exhaustion from constant laboring, from consuming people and content and feeling consumed in the process. It was the pressure to be transparent and continued pressure to be transparent and answerable to on and offline performances of self. And it was the everyday disciplining of my body and Blackness, whether in school, trying to go to the grocery store, even at home within my own families and communities, that got to a point where I began to surveil myself and to hyper surveil other people and spaces to somehow ease or justify my discomfort. And then at some point in all of this, I began to lose connection with my body. It became for the viewing pleasure of other people. And so grew the obsessions over what I lacked or what I felt I lacked. And I believe that's sometimes the point, for us to be present somewhere else, not in our bodies, but in our screens, not with people, but with our obsessions. And this is why I center joy, why joy is so central to this project, because I do not believe we are meant to suffer and that there are other ways for us to be. And just going back to the literacy project and how we're going to focus on Black digital practices and specifically on Black youth digital practices, some of the questions that I have going into this project are: how do Black young people perform identity and affect the digital spaces they encounter? How do they tend to their visibilities online, sustain joy, take time for rest? How do they understand the policing of Black bodies, whether online, in schools, at home, or within Seattle? And how do they embody or reframe or refuse or resist or finesse Blackness? On supporting literacies, I do believe that many of the different literacy models offer specific ways of articulating youth's lived experiences and ways of being in an increasingly digitally mediated world that's demanding of their and our attention, presence, and creative labor. And I also believe most concepts being employed to articulate their experience are prescriptive references to the infinite possibilities of Black performance, being, and expression. Black youth literacies are inherently multilingual and multimodal literacies that can be employed, I believe, for the sole purpose of being, however self-defined. That there are many ways of being, many that fall outside some of the hypervisible narratives of, say, resistance or resilience or justice, and that these include ways of being that, for example, prioritize rest or refusal or illegibility. And so in the spirit of refusal, I'm also refusing naming this project as anything other than what the young people name for themselves. Regarding ways to support Black youth literacies, and specifically ways that I feel I can support Black youth literacies, I intend to draw upon my resources as a filmmaker, my stories of participating on social media and feeling overexposed, as well as the joyful experiences, and also my rituals for healing, namely filmmaking, resting, and art making, so that the young people too have tools for sustaining joy in their lives. And also I have these 4 ways to support Black youth literacies listed here, because as I come into the work and I learn more and more about this project, and I feel more and more about what it is that I feel called to do, I'm learning that these are fundamental ways that we can begin to support them. And that begins with facilitating the space for them to just be, creating opportunities for storytelling as well as story holding, sharing our healing rituals, what it is that works for us, and also, again, providing tools for them to sustain joy and to sustain themselves. And now I'm going to close by sharing a short film I created on not consenting to racializing surveillance. I imagine us creating films just like this one, or ones of their own, that document our stories and our performances, not to capture them, but to have an archive to return to. And I'm also learning how being vulnerable and sitting in visceral feelings can actually contribute to cultivating that space for the sharing and holding of our stories. And this film is titled "I Do Not Consent."
You have 3 parking tickets at the same location, Allen's Avenue and Terminal Street.
3
Allen's-
parking tickets?
No, 3 violations,
Oh, okay.
3 red light violations on Allen's Avenue and Terminal Street. We're gonna look at the.
No, I don't need to look at it because
But-
everybody else who looked at it, they was guilty, so I don't want to see it.
Well-
I already finished this.
Forward, you telling you, all these machines telling you, all these machines telling you, that you are, put you down. All these machines telling you, all these machines telling you.
But it's difficult to wait for everybody in a hurry. Technology, it's fast, it's in a hurry. They're angry, they're frustrated, they got time, they're on the cell phone, they want to text message you, y'all in the same car, you gonna text message him, he right there. You know what I'm saying? You recording this?
Yeah.
It's okay. I'm telling the truth.
What does it say on there? What does it say on there?
No, because you.
What does it say on there?
This is stupid. She didn't even ask.
I have no clue what's going on. You guys want to
This
tell me
is
what's going on? I
ridiculous.
want to know
Yeah,
what's
we
going on.
purchased this basketball in the store. We purchased this basketball in the store.
I told you I paid for. No, I told her I paid for that, and then she kept my son. My son went out running. No, because you knew better. I told you I paid for that.
Back up, babe.
Man,
You should be
I
sorry.
told you I paid
You
for
should
that.
be sorry.
You're
We don't
not,
want
you
it.
shouldn't even.
No,
You're not even
no,
supposed to be following me.
That's true. You're not supposed to be following.
No, because you're stupid.
Clearly, you're intimidating her. Just relax.
She intimidating me.
She is intimidating us. She's harassing her.
I went going after my
She's
son.
following us, running after us. We bought this. No, hold up. Give it to her. She's gonna go reverse it right now. You keep your basketball.
So there's a great deal of confusion at this location. And so I have taken the position that if you are past the first stop line, when the light turns red,
Yes.
that I'll dismiss it. So far, in both of these cases that I just looked at, you were past the first stop line. So these two are going to get dismissed, and we're going to look at the third one now. You still don't want to see it?
No, I want to see them all now. Now I want to see everybody.
You want to see everything, right? All right.
I was just trying not to take up time. You're a smart man. I guess that's why you sitting up there. Yeah,
I won't go that
pull
far.
that
I wouldn't go that far.
out.
Maybe I
Okay.
just got a little lucky.
Yeah.
Thank you all for watching and listening. I've also listed my email here if you ever want to connect or follow up. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jess, so much for transition and segueing us into what follows next. So the previous two presentations, and just bear with me as I share my screen, have really focused on really thinking about literacy in a community context, really thinking about how these literacies are taking place in society through creative video, creative film. And so now what I'm going to think about is, or present on rather, is really taking us into the school setting, very similar to Christina, but really thinking about this along racial and ethnic identity lines. And with that said, I'm going to go ahead and begin, share my screen. And so my presentation today is called, it's a segment, it's a slice of my research that I've, like I said, I've had the luxury of partnering with Nigerian immigrant youth in Central Texas. And so supporting Nigerian immigrant youth identities through literacies in the classroom. And so I want to start off by really anchoring this presentation in my own background. So really thinking about how I grew up. I always like to say I was born in New York City. My mother is an African-American woman born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. And my father is Nigerian who migrated to the United States of America. And so I grew up wedged between both of these identities, racial as well as ethnic. And so I always like to say that I spent a lot of time growing up in Detroit, and I would spend my summers and holidays in New York City. And I have a picture on the left here because when I was in Detroit, which was predominantly with my African-American family, I was known and called Lakia. However, whenever I would travel to New York City, I always like to say the moment I crossed the threshold of my father's door, and then I was in the context of my Nigerian family, I was Iore, which is my Nigerian name. And so very early in life, I learned how our identities can shift and change across geographical lines, and how there are not always the choosing of ourselves. We don't always get to choose that, because some people make those decisions for us. And so that really got me thinking about a lot of things in terms of race and ethnicity. Obviously, I didn't use those terms as a child, but just really thinking about it. And so when I became a classroom teacher, I noticed that a lot of my students who were from all over the world, they were children of parents who immigrated from Cuba, from Dominican Republic, from all these different countries, and from lots of West African countries. And when I was working with my students, I found that my students from Latinx countries were very proud of their heritage and their identities. And my West African students, very similar to me back in Detroit, Michigan, hid and kind of like had a little bit of shame around the African aspects of their identities. And that really got my wheels spinning. And I started to think, well, here we are, years later, I'm still in the classroom. It's not my experience. What is it about school spaces and African youth identities that caused some of that hiding and that shaming versus that lack of pride, which they all showed online through their social media? And so just really thinking about taking a broader step back and really thinking about the United States Black immigrant population. If we take a look, the Pew Research Center has shown us in 2016 and a more recent report that came out in 2022 that the Black immigrant population in the United States is rapidly increasing, and about roughly 1 in 5 Black people in the United States are immigrants or children of Black immigrants. And so we can see that they're also, what does that mean for school spaces? That Black African immigrant youth have enrolled in US schools at unparalleled rates in the last 5 decades. So we're seeing how this population increase is showing up in the school spaces. Now, if we take a look at the literature, we can see that there still remains an almost exclusive emphasis on Latinx as well as Asian immigrant youth and educational scholarship. So we know lots about the language and literacy experiences of youth from these different backgrounds. And we find that, US static racial categories has a lot to do with that. This idea that the Black identity racial category is homogenous, that it's a monolith, right? And so it really overlooks the cultural, the ethnic, and multilingual identity markers of Black youth from the Caribbean as well as African countries. And even when educational scholarship does focus on African immigrant youth, you find that African immigrant youth are predominantly characterized as English language learners, that we don't have any real focus on African immigrant youth who come here because of colonization, who do speak English in this country. And so there's an effect that we have seen that a lot of scholars have brought up, that when African immigrant youth move to this country, they engage in processes of redefining who they are. Lots of silence happening in the classroom and the community spaces, and especially a lot of social isolation, not just in school, but also in community spaces. And so here's the problem, so many problems, but there's one of them that I'll focus on for the sake of today's presentation, that African immigrant youth, especially those who are fluent in and speak English, have been primarily excluded from literacy-focused scholarly, societal, and educational conversations. And that is an issue. And I say that we can go deeper, that it's truly related to the intersection of both anti-Blackness, anti-immigrant sentiments. And when those two things come together, we see that there's been this erasure and this invisibility of Black African immigrant youth. Which brings me to the question that I'm focusing on in today's presentation, 2 questions. And that first one is, what are Nigerian immigrant youth literacy practices, which stems from a broader study that I did in Central Texas? And then also, how do they use their literacy practices to make sense of their identities? And going back to that historical perspective, I'm really drawing on the social as well as the cultural understandings of what it means to be literate and to engage in literacy, not just reading and writing. And so for the sake of this presentation, I'm drawing on a few different frames here. I won't go too deeply into them, but again, thinking about literacy more broadly. And I'm also taking a post-colonial perspective of what it means to engage with this work, this idea that yes, colonization happened, but there are still lingering effects that affect people globally and African immigrant youth, even in the United States. And then also looking at the connections between race and language. And so that really frames the way that I'm looking at the questions as well as the youth that I'll focus on. And so, as I mentioned, the study focused on Nigerian immigrant youth in Central Texas. And you may be wondering, well, why Nigerian immigrant youth? Well, within that Black population, the biggest population that's really coming from African countries predominantly are from Nigeria. And so that really was salient and made the most sense to really focus on. And so I was in Central Texas with the youth, partnered with them, and I mostly was in their homes, but also their church was the epicenter of my work in partnership with them. And I like to tell people that over time, they decided to take the lead. They got in the driver's seat and said, I want to go here. They decided to want to go to the mall, to the recreational center, ice cream shop, and they really took this project and ran with it and made it what it is today. And so though I worked with 6 youth across various age groups, varying and their total years spent in the United States. For today's presentation, I'm going to focus on 2, Okoko, who's a 10-year-old, and she was in 5th grade. She had been in the United States for 8 years, as well as Chika, and she was 13 years old at the time of this research project, and she had been in the United States for just 1 year. And so I won't go into all of this, but I just like to say that this study and the way that we designed it, co-designed it together, took place across 3 phases, across 11 months. So really partnering with the youth, asking them how they identified with their parents, spending time with them in their homes and their communities, interviewing them, their parents, their literacy teachers, and then finally giving them in that 3rd phase, we can see writing about language literacies and identities, really giving them the opportunity to write about creative stories so that they can show me how their identity changed across time when they wrote these stories, which they chose different settings. And so for the sake of today's presentation, I'm only going to focus on one of the findings. And I say that after working with the youth, interviewing their teachers, working alongside their parents, we found that their multi-literacy practices, and you may be wondering what's multi-literacy, but it's this idea that literacy can exist in multifacets. Dance, kind of connecting to Jazz's presentation, right? Visual arts, music, all these creative digital literacies. Working with them, when the youth engaged in these type of literacies in schools, it fostered and sustained healthy social emotional well-being, and it helped to foster a sense of belonging. And you may be asking how or why. Well, stick with me. All right. And so I mentioned that I would focus on 2 youth. And so Okoko, I kind of call her, and she referred to herself, which was something that really annoyed her, was the expert on Africa. And so this is a quote from when we were talking, and she kind of just shared with me something that happens with her in the classroom quite often. And she says, it makes me feel frustrated because they think I know everything about being an African. They ask me, how does Africa look? And how does this? And is it hot there? And stuff like that. I prefer that they not ask me to share my language with them because I don't really know much of my language. So I don't want to be forced into teaching them that. And keeping in mind that she came to the United States when she was 2 years old. She'd been here for 8 years. So she knew more about America than she knew about Nigeria, and especially Africa, which is a whole continent. So it's impossible for her to know that. And then also because of a lot of that pressure, remember I talked about that colonial nature, which is very present and prevalent in schools, especially for African youth. A lot of what is taught about Africa comes from a colonial perspective, that it's impoverished and that it's under-resourced, right? And so a lot of that really conflicted and intersected with her identity. And she talks about it here and the impact that it had on the way that she talked. And she says, most of everyone ignores me. Whenever I get to class in the morning, I mean, there's no hi or hello or anything like that, but it's definitely different from my other classmates. So I guess my brain instantly knows that I'm not around people that I don't know well. So my speech just changes. I guess it's like that because I'm not close to them, so my speech changes. So really going back to that connection between race, ethnicity, and language, you can see that her school setting and a lot of the ideas that they had about being African, and also the closeness and lack of intimacy that she felt with her peers in school, forced her to really put on what she called her American language and her American accent, which was very different from at home where she spoke Nigerian pidgin, and she would also take pride in using what she referred to as her Nigerian accent. So really thinking about how school spaces have ideas and perspectives that make, in this case, Okoko and many other African immigrant youth kind of step into a more American style of speech to kind of find a sense of belonging. And when we think about literacies, when working with Okoko, she shared that she loved to draw, right? And she felt a sense of authenticity as well as desired belonging through her visual art literacies. So she entered an art contest and she ended up drawing an art piece that made it to her school's t-shirt and contest, and she won this contest. And she talked about how this was really important for her because it helped her to gain visibility and for people to know her more than being an expert on Africa. It helped her to form new friendships. She gained support from friends who encouraged her to encourage drawing. So I share this to say that the visual arts literacies was very instrumental in really helping her to show up and to be seen and to be known as someone that she desired to be known, versus a lot of these colonial and stereotypical understandings of what it means to be African. And then I'm also going to focus on a quote from Chika's teacher, and I call this dancing away shyness. And her teacher says here, you know, Chika, she definitely came in really quiet and shy. The arts are really a great way to help with that. I know lots of newcomers to this country. They come in, and if they're put into dance class, it's just crazy what I hear about them in my dance class compared to their core academic classes. You know, we don't have that problem. So Chika was predominantly described as very shy and not necessarily outgoing, but in dance class, again, this is a literacy. If we're thinking about literacy as a multi-literacy, in dance class, she really showcased a very social, bubbly personality. And so I'm saying that both visual arts as well as dancing were phenomenal and instrumental in helping the youth to build community and to really help with their social, emotional, just challenges of immigration altogether. And so in wrapping up with thinking about some practical considerations, I'm saying that schools, community educational organizations should really reconceptualize language and literacy education. And I'm arguing that we should open multi-literate curricular spaces at schools to support African immigrant youth identities, their mental well-being, and especially their transition into U.S. school spaces and to society. And so I do want to thank you so much for your time and joining us and being in community with us. I've also included my email as well as Twitter as another academic space as well. So thank you. All righty. So I know we're all here now. And so what we're going to do really quickly before we open up the floor for Q&A, we're going to take some time to really focus on some of the connections across all of them. And so I'm going to wrap up with some closing remarks with thinking about this idea, really taking us back to where we started, which was this historical framing that Dr. Willis really focused on, right? This idea that literacy has been contested, that it has been debated for decades. And even in 2023, that article was in 1997, it is still being contested, and it's still a connection between what is literacy and the state of the United States, literally, politically, racially, ethnically. And you will always find, if you take a look at history, that there's always tension between what is literacy and what's the political uproar or tension in the country. And so I just want to bring us back to this, the point in the argument is that the science of reading, this idea that literacy is just reading and writing, and that it is just a skill, and that it's just knowledge, it does not and cannot capture it all. That we actually do youth a disservice when we put boundaries around what it means to be literate, what it means to engage in literacy. And we're saying, all of us, that there needs to be space for both. Yes, the comprehension, the fluency, the vocabulary, and we're saying, and as Christina so beautifully said, the multimodalities, the multilingualism. So beautifully, as Jazz said, the film, the visual literacies to cultivate that joy, that freedom, that agency, and especially resistance. Yes, youth should be able, especially youth of color, Black youth, especially because of all the racial tensions and anti-Blackness, should be invited to be able to refuse engaging in certain aspects of society, and especially in the classroom. And when we open up what counts as literacy, that in itself is a form of liberation and freedom. And as you can see across all of our presentations, they were rooted in the arts. They were rooted in multimodalities. They were rooted in multiliteracies. And as you can see, we went beyond words. We went beyond print because we wanted to focus on, across all of our presentations in tandem, this beautiful heart work that we're all doing, building empathy, embodied responses, which Jazz so beautifully captured, affirming that identity, which Christina so beautifully captured with those testimonials, the multimodal testimonials, and really fostering that agency and choice, as you even saw in my presentation with Chika and Okoko, really saying, who do I want to be seen as? I'm not the expert on Africa. I'm actually an artist, and this is how I would like to be seen. And so there are so many considerations. We won't have time for all of it today, but really thinking about what does it mean to really think about educational justice, not just within a school setting, but within a global and in a societal setting. Because if we cannot talk about making sure that education and society is just for youth without making sure that we are tailoring education and that we are tailoring literacy to suit who they are, not just as students, but as human beings, racially, ethnically, linguistically, geographically. Our youth are spending so much time online today, and there are some drawbacks with that, but we also have to accept the fact that the digital world is their reality. And how do we even begin to think about bringing digital literacies into school spaces and partnering with youth, partnering with families to make sure that we're not just educating for skills, that we're not just educating for knowledge, but that we are educating in partnership for humanity, for liberty, for justice, and truly for freedom for all, which is what this country, purports to do. And it's one thing to say it, and it's another thing to actually do it. So thank you.
Thank you all so much. Really powerful ideas. And I want to invite folks to ask some questions, tell us what you're thinking, what are you wondering about? It looks like there's lots of positive comments in the chat, but I'm curious what people are wondering about. Maybe we'll give folks a couple of minutes to let ideas steep. One thing that I'm curious about is how these ideas are received by teachers that you're encountering in elementary and middle school and high school. What kinds of reactions are folks having to really expanding their idea of what literacy can mean? It's a little mind-blowing, right, for lots of folks. So I'm just curious what kinds of receptions you all have encountered. I guess that's open to anybody who feels like.
I can start because I'm in the very beginning. So far I've workshopped this project at a conference last year, and it was incredible because my intention was for it to be me with a bunch of youth, and it actually ended up being a family affair. So many of my family members were there, and a lot of people in my family are teachers. So it's actually really beautiful. So I tell people about what I'm doing, like my family, but it was like, hey, we can all be a part of this experience together. And so some of the feedback I got was really interesting because I intentionally say that it's for Black young people from ages 11 to 19. So some advice I've gotten is perhaps you should consider that age gap, that range. Maybe I should consider, only focusing on high school or only focusing on middle school. I think it's also interesting too that I've had some people say oh, you can't have, high schoolers with middle schoolers. It's like a no. It's incredibly interesting because I think about too how when we went through school and how students today are grouped by age and by grade in such a way. And so that's kind of that range is intentionally to kind of break away from that. But it's something that I'm actively thinking about as I continue the work, is just kind of things to consider. Because for me, I can imagine us all being in the room and then the high schoolers or even the middle schoolers also becoming mentors themselves, teachers themselves in the space. So that's why, as part of the reason why I also wanted to continue that with that range. So that's some of the early feedback I've gotten. And also I've gotten a lot of feedback from family and other teachers that something like this feels kind of needed. Because if you think a lot about the way in which a lot of these platforms are taking a lot of our attention, some of it's beautiful, some of it's overwhelming. There's a lot of in between there, and just kind of creating a space. And for me, it's a space that's not within the school, but a space we create outside of school, and to have these conversations and to perhaps have a space for them to be when they otherwise cannot or otherwise have to still experience some of that disciplining that's going on in schools today.
Thank you, Jazz. Does anyone else have a response to that question? Want to share?
Yeah, so I work with teacher candidates too. And when I ask them, how are you going to make sure that this lesson is accessible to everyone and that they can showcase their knowledge? And they bring in that multimodality component by letting their students showcase their knowledge that is not limited to just reading and writing. There's students who they considered once shy, flourish, and thrive. And it reminds me of one moment with one student where I was working with them in math. And then we moved into storytelling about animals and science, and he was allowed to create a guinea pig out of clay. And he just created a story that was so long, and it was just so amazing. And just seeing that confidence in our student, our teachers are responding a lot to that multimodality. And like Lakia said, it's not replacing, it's just adding that and component into literacy.
I'll share briefly. I remember when I was working with all the youth and when I was in Central Texas. And so I remember, like, as I mentioned, they were the ones who were like, I would go to their homes and, I would say, well, what do we want to do this week? Because it was mostly set up as like home communal observations. And after a while, they were like, the girls were like, oh, I want to go to Starbucks, or I want to go to Forever 21. And with my understanding of literacy, I'm like, oh, there are fashion literacies there. There's so many literacies, reading the menu at Starbucks. There's so many ways to engage with literacy. And I remember one time, Chica's mom had come in, these are all pseudonyms. Chica's mom had come out and said, this is not educational. This is not literacy. She pulled out the library card and she was like, take them to the library. And so it was interesting to see even the tensions, not just like within the school setting, but even within families, this idea that, literacy is a book. Take her to the library, take her to the book. This is not being, this is not a form of education. So there was some pushback. I feel like depending on who the teachers were and kind of like what their teacher education training, which is a huge part of this, right? How are teachers trained? But just even thinking about some of the cultural disconnects or cultural beliefs of ideas of what it means to engage in literacy. So there were so many funny moments across with working with all the youth, and the parents were like, that you're taking them to the basketball recreational center. That's not a literacy. No, pull out your book, write an essay. And that was, part of partnering with them and saying, okay, well, this is what the parents want. I'm in your community, I'm in your space, I'm going to go with your flow and I'm going to honor what, and so a lot of this, as Christina kind of brought us back to it, it's not replacement of, but it's like, okay, we can, maybe have the recreational sports literacies in one aspect, but we're also honoring, going back to culturally sustaining elements as well, as Paris and Aline talked about, but still honoring that within the context of what, families still value, even if I don't always agree with it. So I think it's a delicate balance.
That's really helpful. Thank you all.
Is it okay if I pose a question? Because I know Christina and Jazz do like some really like amazing just work with literacy. I think it would be helpful to hear too. I know you all talked about your connections too, but I always like to, I think it would be good to hear, how did you come to this literacy work, right? Jazz, you talked about it so much in classes, this idea of, I don't want to define this thing. It's, why do I can it just be being, right? So kind of, I wonder if you two would be willing to talk about your own journeys. And Christina, I know in Foundations of LOC, you talked a lot about your own journey in Austin, Texas. So I think it would be helpful perhaps to hear about your own journey and what brought you to really thinking about conceptualizing literacy in this way. They have really powerful stories. So.
Well, I grew up in the border region of Juarez and El Paso, and I feel like it was a very clear separation of the languages and the cultures. And whenever I moved between one place and the other, like you was saying, I had like a different identity. And just like a few weeks back, I was talking to my partner and I was like, I don't know why I'm shy in English, but I'm not shy in Spanish. And it's just that there was no place for them to coexist. And then unlearning that culture is like two separate, like I'm Mexican and I'm American, but really it's dynamic. and it can coexist, and just embracing that. And so finding what Ansaldúa calls Nepantla, or the state of being in between two cultures, and the values and everything, and how it's just part of your identity and it can coexist. It just like really reminded me in my time in Austin as an educator, where we would separate the languages strategically so students would speak English and Spanish, and instead of bilingualism, it was more like double monolingualism, and how I want to like come back into where these languages can coexist, and just so that our students can be themselves holistically. Because sometimes I feel like the curriculum we are asked to implement creates borders in our identities. At least that's how I see it myself too. I have these tensions with borders, and then how am I gonna see myself as a whole human being rather than Cristina and Christina?
I want to just start by sharing, like, I'm noticing this place connection among us, Texas. So like, Akia, you've done your work in Central Texas. Like, that's where my hometown is. Christina, I believe you're a student and educator in Austin, Texas. I also spent a lot of time there as a student and lived there. So I was like, I've noticed it before, but I don't think I've ever said it. And it's like, it's really interesting that we come into this space together. But for me, like, I don't want to call my this a transition. Like, I didn't transition in a way, but like, I studied when it began in advertising in Austin. That's where I started. I studied advertising. I was doing a lot of the research for brands, a lot of that storying and storytelling. And this is what I was doing, like, this is what I want to do as a career, for example. But simultaneously, those experiences I shared of madness and experience, that was happening simultaneously in my life and my everyday. And so I got to a point in my master's program where I'm like, I was still holding on to this idea that I would be in communication and I would be studying advertising. And I was also beginning my healing work and coming through a lot and learning a lot and having these conversations. And that's where I was feeling the most full, if that makes sense. And then now I'm in my PhD, and I'm again trying to like grapple with the fact that I don't want to do advertising. It's like, it's not my thing. It's not what I'm interested in. I'm constantly becoming and shaping and changing. And I was like, man, well, I have spent all this time studying all this stuff, I was like, well, I've always wanted to teach. I've always enjoyed teaching, whether as a TA or facilitating spaces that I can sometimes do now. And so I was like, that's where it started coming together. And so I found myself learning and thinking about literacy. And what I most appreciate, Lakia, now that I've taken 2 of your classes, and we've gone over the different models of what literacy has been as a skill, as a currency. And what I've held on to the most is your definition of literacy as communication. And it's actually emboldened me and been very affirming, because I know we understand the siloed nature of academia and disciplines. So as someone studying within the communication department, I keep getting called upon to say, oh, you want to do this literacy program? Oh, we get why, and we get what you're doing, but let's make it communication. Let's talk about why it's communication. But sitting in that truth of literacy is communication. I think that's kind of why I'm refusing to name or refusing to define, because I just want to sit in what it is and what feels right and the work that I'm doing, and just kind of continuing to grow and shape and change from there.
Thank you for sharing your stories. It's really lovely to hear a little bit about your personal journeys. I'm curious about how what you all have seen in terms of the impacts of expanding the definition of literacy on reading and writing. I'm just curious about what that looks like.
I think I'll share. I think a lot, funny enough, I didn't know I was doing it. Again, going back to what Jazz just mentioned, calling a thing, like, we're just like, why do we have to name it? And I remember when I was in Harlem, New York, it was when I was wrapping up my classroom teaching career, and I would just show my students films and have them write poems, because I was just like, we had a lot of freedom with the curricula, the literacy curricula. And so I found that you know, and let's be real, we were in West Harlem and people had these ideas, especially as the neighborhood was becoming more gentrified, of, you know, what does it mean to, and I also want to contextualize it by saying we were in a school building, which is not uncommon in New York City, that was a big building and there were 5 different schools. 4 were charter, we were the only public school. So we already had this image of like, we were the, you know, disruptive, we had the disruptive students, we had the bad students, right? And so I think, you know, my students had kind of, some of them had taken on this identity, like, this is who we are, nobody cares about us, right? And so a sense of hopelessness. And I remember bringing in, I shared the film with you all, you know, American Promise, that was one of the films that I shared in the class to as an option to watch. And I remember sharing that film with one of my students, and he was a young Black boy in Harlem, and he, you know, he would come to class late all the time, but I would never forget, by introducing again a modality, the visual arts film, how that really just captured him. He was not really feeling the traditional curriculum of reading and writing and all the books, even though I'd gone above and beyond. And I'm like, you're going to read Sharon Draper, Tears of a Tiger, this Black phenomenal African-American woman who writes about all these teen issues, and he just wasn't really feeling it. But when I brought in film, that really captivated him. And it wasn't just him, but it was so many students and how they came alive and how they interacted with the curricula, because it was their lives and they saw something reflected back to them that reflected who they were and the way that they got to engage with it. And then we went back to the test prep, which was so boring, right? Filling in the bubbles, you know. And so I saw the highs and lows of introducing different modalities in the classroom. Like I said, I didn't know it was something I was doing. I was like, I just got to get my kids and my students to, you know, stay engaged. And so I saw the impact, not just in the literacy classroom, but on who they were. And they opened up to me more and they would share things with me more. And he stopped coming to school late every day. And he was like, Miss Omegun, you got another film? You know, I want to watch another. And I would never forget that. And, you know, and I think we have all these mandates and these policies, right? Big, grand policies to try to change education. And I always like to say that it happens in the small, minute ways that are not, you know, happening on, you know, on Capitol Hill or things like that. And so I saw the impact of just even building trust and building empathy. And I'm still connected with so many of them on social media today. And they're still like, Miss Omegun, I remember when. And it's not about the book, it's not about the essay, it's about those moments of all these beautiful modalities. And so again, going back to humanity, we're human first. And so I got to see that beauty and really just, I don't know, going back to what Jazz also talked about, like this freedom and this joy, this opening up through expanding what we count as literacy. And that can happen in the math classroom, that could happen in the science classroom, that can happen in any academic discipline area. It's not just, you know, relegated to literacy either. So.
Thank you so much. Well, are there other questions that you all might have for one another? Or final comments that you want to share?
I just want to share my appreciation for being here. It's affirming. I'm going into this work like it's just, I'm very appreciative and grateful to be here.
I also feel a lot of gratitude for being here today and just listening to these conversations, which are so important.
And of course, I'll echo the phenomenal Jazz and Christina equally, and just Deborah and Kendra, thank you so much for bringing us here, for drawing us together, and for making this space for us to, talk about these topics and ideas, but I always like to say this is real life. So I just want to express gratitude as well. Thank you.
Thank you. We're so grateful that all of you were able to join us, our panelists, as well as our audience, our guests. And I have a little bit more to share. Let's see here. Great. All right. Just want to invite everybody to join us for any of our upcoming webinars as well. We're so glad that you were able to make it today. Next week, we have 2 more exciting discussions. On Monday, our topic will be on working towards justice-centered multilingual science and literacy pedagogies. And leading that discussion will be Dr. Jessica Thompson, Dr. Patricia Venegas Weber, and Christina Betancourt, as well as some of their teacher partners. And then on Wednesday next week, we'll be joined by Dr. Sylvia Bagley and 4 teacher leaders from Washington State to discuss centering students in all we do in conversation with teacher leaders. And we also have some exciting events coming up this summer. Some of the topics that we'll be offering are listed here. Most of them, if not all of them, are available for registration. And you can find that, and you can find registration on our website. If you are interested if these topics sound interesting to you, but you're looking for something more than just a summer offering, our office can work with you to create a more customized professional learning experience for your team or school or district. And if you're interested in that, you can reach out to us at our email, connected@uw.edu. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Lakia, Jazz, and Christina. And we hope to connect again soon.